an original MCM production.
Now I'd like to ask John Tivon to come forward. He's President and CEO of Home Care Medical. He will introduce our program. John?
Thank you, President Dan. Understanding how trauma response influences behavior has the power to unlock all forms of human potential, from the world of child welfare, the courts, and even corporate Milwaukee. Today's presentation will introduce you to this life-changing science with a focus on the Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE, study. Our co-presenters today, Tim Grove and Judge Mary Triggiano, will discuss what a trauma response looks like and what professionals and citizens in Metro Milwaukee can do to create a trauma-informed community. Tim is the Chief Clinical Officer at St. A, formerly St. Emilion Lakeside. It's a social service agency with over 165 years of service to children and families. Tim serves as a senior leader responsible for the trauma-informed care initiatives throughout the agency. Tim has his bachelor's degree in social work from Wartburg College and a master's from UW. Tim also has 20 years of human service experience in a variety of direct care and administrative roles. Judge Mary Triano is a graduate of UW-Madison Law School and has been a Milwaukee County Circuit Court judge since 2004. Her assignment was in the Children's Division from August of 2004 to August of 2009. She then was assigned to the Domestic Violence Court, handling adult misdemeanor, felony domestic abuse, and child abuse cases. She came back to the Children's Court in August 14 and is currently its presiding judge. As if that weren't all enough, she also leads the Family Drug Treatment Court and is creating the first of its kind in Wisconsin, the Safe Baby Court. And if that weren't enough, she is a Deputy Chief Judge to Judge Maxine White. So please join me in extending a warm Milwaukee Rotary Club welcome to Tim and Judge Mary.
Thank you, John, and thank you to Mary McCormick and all of you fine Milwaukee Rotarians who we've had the pleasure of interacting with before in a couple of different ways. It is always good to be here, and I think you will sort of agree with me after you hear Judge Triggiano talk about the Adverse Childhood Experience study and her role in this work, that she is a fantastic addition to the team in terms of talking about this very important topic. And as we were preparing for this presentation, and Rita was helping us pull all the details together, she emphasized to us, you get a half an hour. And you will quickly discover for both Judge Triggiano and I, that's going to be the most challenging part of this entire interaction. So when I was pulling information together to show you visually today, I thought, okay, what is the first slide we want to show to hopefully garner your attention and sort of lend credibility to sort of the priority that we think this topic brings to our community. And this is what I came up with. So this is probably best viewed as a metaphor. This is what happens in a PET scan when you expose a human being, especially a developing human being as a child, to not just significant things that make them afraid, like physical abuse or sexual abuse or sort of other forms of violence, but also when you frankly fundamentally neglect them. So when you see slides like this, these almost always come from kids who have significant developmental neglect as part of their profile, meaning that in this case, this is an orphanage kid in Eastern Europe who probably was interacted with on sort of 4 times a day on a schedule, and that was it. Meaning for the vast majority of the rest of their waking hours, there was little stimulation. So keep that in mind as you think about sort of what the effects are of exposure to adversity and stress and trauma, because this metaphor, while this is an extreme perspective, is helpful to think of in terms of what happens in the developing brain. Imagine this brain at the age of 8 sitting in a classroom trying to sort of make neural connections to learn a new concept. Imagine this brain trying to manage its own immune system in terms of response to sort of infection and disease. Imagine this brain at the age of 26 in one of your workplaces trying to figure out how to remain productive and decide not to go home or to call in work that next day. The real sort of priority behind what we're talking about today is what it sort of offers us in terms of collective possibility. What we know and what we understand we can prevent. So our mission in talking to groups like you and talking to other groups we talk to is to introduce you to this science, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, a little bit about what happens when sort of exposure to frequent forms of adversity takes place, and then a little bit of time at the end talking about what we can do. So hopefully we've garnered your attention sufficiently. And having done that, I'll ask Judge Triggiano to come up and talk about the ACEs study and very briefly walk you through that.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. I really appreciate it. So Tim forgot to tell you to fasten your seatbelts. And what I'm going to tell you now, too, is you're only going to get 30 minutes of this, but please have an appetite for learning. This stuff is so important. I still learn from Tim every day when I do these trainings with him. And I try to do my own research out there and work with people in the community around adverse childhood experiences and what we can do better as a community for our families that we serve. So I was taking my daughter to school today, and she says, well, Mom, what are you doing this morning? And I said, well, I'm going to go speak on childhood trauma again. And she goes, can't you talk to people about something that's more happy? And I said, well, it's hard stuff, but as Tim said, it gives us this great opportunity to learn this and try to make a difference and move our families and the communities we serve in a different direction. And so I'm hoping we'll get that across here today. So I don't want a show of hands, just kind of keep a tally in your own minds about the next sort of 10 questions I'm going to ask you. Does anybody here know anybody that was physically, sexually, or emotionally abused? Does anybody know anybody that was physically or emotionally neglected, all as a child? How about anybody know anybody who's witnessed domestic violence growing up? How about someone who was exposed to a household member that had mental illness or was a substance abuser? How about a child, knowing a child who experienced some sort of parental divorce or separation? And last, the 10th, does anybody know somebody as a child who had a member of the household that was incarcerated? So you might say, well, Judge, you know, those are the families on your docket. Well, you'd be right, especially working in child welfare and the criminal justice system. But 2 doctors back in the late 1990s set out to do a survey of over 17,000 folks in California, asking these similar questions to them. And then they wanted to examine the health and social effects of adverse childhood experiences, those experiences that I just mentioned to you, and its impact on adult health and well-being. And the survey was to people who were 19 to 94 years old, very well educated, white, upper middle class. And what they found out even surprised them, and them being Dr. Anda and Dr. Folletti, and I'm not even switching this. I got so excited about teaching this stuff. What surprised Dr. Anda and Folletti through this survey of those 17,000 participants in California was that the frequency of adverse childhood experiences was much higher than expected. Only 33% had 0 ACEs. Where there was 1 ACE, there was usually 1 more. In fact, 87% of the time, there was at least 1 other ACE. They also noted that ACEs had a cumulative effect. Also, as the number of ACEs, adverse childhood experience, increased, so did the likelihood of such things as depression, cancer, suicide, and alcoholism significantly increase. What the ACE study revealed was that painful, powerful relationships between emotional experiences as a child had an effect on the physical well-being and mental health of folks as they grew up into adulthood. This shows us the ACE score and the prevalence of severe obesity. The ACE study was actually an outgrowth of an obesity study in the mid-1980s by Dr. Folletti, where they found that the majority of the dropouts who were actually successful in losing weight had gained it all back and gained it back quickly. What they came to find out was that a lot of those folks who were successful in losing weight actually had sexual assault histories. In fact, the vast majority of them. That then precipitated the ACE study. As you can see here, as the prevalence of ACEs go from 0 to 4 or more ACEs, the prevalence of severe obesity actually doubled. We can see that impact on other ACE-attributed problems. So for instance, if you had an ACE score of 4 or more, you were 6 more times as likely to have sex before the age of 15, 7 times more likely to be an alcoholic, 12 times more likely to have attempted suicide, and the story goes on and on. As the prevalence of ACEs increased, so did the increase in the potentially having these kinds of problems. So after the ACE study in California, other states began to do their own ACE studies. And the Child Abuse and Prevention Board did their own ACE study in Wisconsin using the Behavioral Health Risk Survey. They actually did 3 surveys, very similar data that the ACE study, the original ACE study in California found. What they found that ACEs were common in Wisconsin to the population that was surveyed. 58% reported growing up experiencing at least one ACE, and 14% reported 4 or more. ACEs were interrelated and cumulative, as the ACE study in California was. And again, what they showed was that as the number of ACEs increased from 0 to 4, the likelihood of poor outcomes significantly increased. So here shows 3 columns. The first column is the Kaiser study. That's the California study. It was done out of Kaiser Permanente, California HMO that was quite populated by individuals. These are those questions that I asked you earlier on: household dysfunction, abuse, and neglect. The Kaiser column, the first column, shows the percentage of those experiencing those issues. The second column is the Wisconsin ACE study or ACE survey. You can see that the Kaiser numbers are very similar to Wisconsin's numbers in terms of the incidence of these kinds of issues. The original Wisconsin ACE study did not have questions on neglect, but since then the newer studies have asked about neglect across the state. The third column is an independent living cohort, 18 to 25-year-olds from St. A, who they surveyed, and as you can see, their numbers are extremely high. And this is the kind of population that the courts deal with both in the criminal and child welfare setting. I'm gonna let you do the urban.
I was presenting on this topic a few years ago, and a woman came up to me at one of the breaks and said something that I think I will keep telling probably until I stop teaching this. She said, Mr. Grove, I find it fascinating, all this data from San Diego, California. And I also find it interesting that when, frankly, 18,000 mostly white, well-educated, middle-class folks talked about their adversity, that people stood up and took notice. She said, I just find it interesting, though, that in my community, this was an African-American woman, this has been going on for a long, long time, and nobody seemed to care. And I say that introducing this context of urban ACEs because Dr. Roy Wade and colleagues out in Philadelphia said, you know what? those 10 questions in San Diego might be their truth, and it might be what's relevant to them. Our perspective is a little bit different here in urban Philadelphia, so we're going to add some questions to the original 10, and we're going to capture some perspective on race in terms of frequency. So they looked at violence in the neighborhood. They looked at being discriminated against. They looked at being bullied, feeling unsafe in their neighborhood or living in foster care. And you can see on this slide the breakdown, the overall breakdown in this urban sample, and then the breakdown between white and black folks in Philadelphia. And it injects sort of what Judge Triggiano was referencing in this prior slide, this notion that it's a helpful frame to think about that experiential script, what happens for people when there's exposure, and in sort of what dosing does it come based on where you live, as many of you know, based on your zip code, based on many of the other factors that sort of can reasonably predict what dosing looks like. So people have kicked this around in a variety of different ways. This is some research done by Dr. Fang et al., looking at sort of this data from a cost point of view. The number, I guess, that probably jumps out to most of you is that $500 billion. So let me be clear about what that $500 billion represents. That represents, this is some really good empirical work. In this country, about 500,000 kids are substantiated for abuse and neglect in our child welfare systems. The child welfare experts would tell you that is a gross undersampling. That just because sort of we can't substantiate abuse or neglect doesn't mean it didn't happen. So when we're talking about sample size here, we're talking about a very conservative sample. Knowing what we know about the effects of adversity and trauma, we can then take a look and say, how do we add up the cost over a course of their lifetime in premature death, in sort of productivity issues, in healthcare costs, in incarceration costs, et cetera, et cetera. And for every group of kids in a given year over the course of their lifetime, the estimate is $500 billion in terms of our collective cost. And so it starts to add some perspective in terms of just how significant or salient of an issue is this conversation we're having. And then I pull up a slide from Dr. Rob Ando, one of the co-principal investigators of the original study, using words very carefully, saying, in his view, it is the single leading determinant of the health and well-being of our country. So, what do we do with all this? Sometimes it can be overwhelming, sometimes it can be pretty daunting. One of the responses that we've created in our communities is this notion called trauma-informed care. And Mary McCormick and I were sort of talking just before this conversation around, gosh, a lot of people hear about this and say, what is it? It's kind of this elusive thing. We think that makes sense, but we also think it can actually be pretty simple. So let me introduce it in a couple of different ways. I just encourage you to take a couple of seconds to figure out how you would fill in this blank. So the major modifier of all human experience is, and according to Bruce Perry, he would fill in this blank with the word experience. If you're paying attention to the current discussion around epigenetics and genetics in the medical field, you know that nature-nurture conversation is sort of, we're developing new insights around that every day. But probably a fair conclusion around that conversation is that we have under-prioritized the effects of experience, not just in terms of these outcomes we're going to talk about, but in terms of how they might influence how our genes get expressed. You have your DNA, but it can lay dormant, or it can be expressed, or it can be overexpressed. And we think the effects of what we're talking about today can have significant impact on how that happens. That's a pretty powerful new discovery in terms of understanding what goes on when we talk about stress and trauma. So when we talk about experiences, most of us have heard the word resilience, and we say that's the outcome we want to create. This slide sort of offers perspective, suggesting that when we have experiences, especially for our developing brains, so think of our younger kids, but also for all of us adults, that have elements of predictableness, moderate and controlled sort of dosaging of stress, we actually build resilience. There's an important message sort of hidden in this slide. Stress is not our enemy. It's how stress occurs and in what form it occurs that we get more worried about. As a matter of fact, in the helicopter parenting age, where people work really hard to sort of insulate their kids from any kind of stress, we would argue that probably does them a disservice as well. What we're going to talk about today, though, is the number of kids and adults that we're concerned about, and frankly, that sort of work our way throughout our community, who have experiential scripts that are on the left side of this slide. They are overwhelming, they're unpredictable, they are severe, and when that happens, we get very predictable outcomes like that first slide I showed you, where there is literally toxic effect, sort of killing developing nerve cells in these folks' brains, meaning that the parts of their brain they need to survive in the education setting, in the workplace setting, have limited or sort of inefficient potential to do just what we want them to do. So this is where I try to add a little bit of levity to the conversation. Always an interesting thing with the lights a little bit low. So I'm from Iowa. John didn't tell you that, but I'm from Iowa. And in Iowa, we think that cows make a noise where the M and the O are reversed. So in Iowa, we think cows make a noise that goes like, mmm. Now, I don't know about you Wisconsin folks. I presume most of you are from Wisconsin. You probably argue with the rest of the world that there's an M in front of the O, and cows make a mmm noise. Now, I can see Mary and John are saying, I thought they were going to talk about trauma. Where is this conversation going? I bring this up because it's kind of a fun way to sort of talk about how a child learns that a cow is a cow. Back to this conversation around the value of experience. If you just sort of think back to your kids and your grandkids and your nieces and nephews, I know it sounds kind of trite and simple, but how did that happen? They were shown images of a goofy-looking animal with black and white spots and a pink udder, and someone said, look, honey, that's a cow. And then if you're from Iowa, you made the noise, and if you're from Wisconsin, you did the moo noise. And with sufficient repetition, neurons or sets of neurons come together and form a neural pathway, and you're driving down the road across one of our glorious fields, you see one of those goofy animals, and the 18-month-old says, cow, right? And everybody claps and says that's a really big deal. So that's great. That's a really simple way to understand neuronal process and how pathways are formed and how experience creates outcomes. Let's make it a little more real back to this conversation. So this is a slide from Dr. Perry around on the left sort of side of this slide, the vertical axis, if you will, is a mental state sort of paradigm. The idea that we can be calm or we can be in terror, calm at the bottom and terror at the top, because when we are sitting in mom's tummy, we are about as calm as we get. It's a perfect 98.7 degrees. It's nice and dark, kind of like this room is now. There's not a lot of stimuli going on, and it's perfectly warm. And then, forgive me, women, this is going to be a little crass. You come out, and things are very different, right? You now have a lot of stimuli. You now have some cold that you experience. You now have a lot of sort of stuff that goes on that changes your mental state to one of fear and terror. And then those of you know how this process works, because it's been part of human history for forever. You swaddle, you pick up, you rock, and often eventually the baby sucks, and lo and behold, the mental state starts to drop and they feel relief from distress. I want to point out a couple of things in this slide for you because it's critical to appreciating the effects of trauma. That horizontal axis is sort of measured by time, and if you think of the middle part of that state of arousal, the vertical axis, as being not fear or terror, but maybe just a little bit of alarm, eventually that sort of state will start to drop and kids will become calm or regulated. The other thing that happens, and this is really critical to not just sort of academic performance, social performance, but workplace performance, is they will start to mitigate or modulate stress quickly and effectively. So literally, if they're in a work setting and they got a really difficult instruction, and we need them to sort of get back to work and respond to that within 5 minutes, their ability to do that may have its seeds, at least in part, in these early experiences. Let me show you a different slide. These are the people who've experienced significant adversity and trauma. And if you look at what happens in these circumstances, maybe mom or dad is struggling with alcohol or drugs, and so they're passed out on the couch. And now as baby is crying because they're trying to get a fundamental need met of being fed, look at what happens in terms of their state level, a constant state of fear or terror. And look at what happens on that horizontal axis around sense of time to recovery. It gets longer and longer and longer. These are the neurobiological effects of what we're talking about today. We have a growing population of our fellow Milwaukee residents and citizens who have this as their experiential script. And make no mistake, we are seeing it in our schools. We are seeing it in our child welfare and juvenile justice settings. And I think it's probably also fair to say you are seeing it in your places of employment, maybe just thinking about it from a different frame. And so what happens for many of these folks neurobiologically is they quickly discover that if their experiential script was one, if you look at the middle left of this slide, where positive human interaction was not part of what happened for them, where for most of us, when we smile at someone, we get a little feel-good dopaminergic reward process going on, they quickly realize that that didn't happen for them, and therefore humans can't be trusted, so they go to other sources. I joke in the sweet, salty, fatty foods category about the Baconator at Wendy's. I think Wendy's has the Baconator. Some of you might have seen this big triple-pound, multiple bacon hamburger kind of thing. But if you look at this in terms of how it starts to give perspective on the choices people take to engage in behavior that to us might sort of look pejorative, to them makes complete sense. There's a stress hormone called allopregnanolone that chemically is almost a twin to alcohol. It is not a surprise that many people with experiences of trauma and adversity use alcohol as a coping mechanism, and we think it probably effectively resets their neurobiology, which can lead to some of those addictive processes. It starts to give us perspective in terms of the social cost around how people respond and adapt to their experiential script. So let me make a really quick argument about what can possibly happen, because when we talk to groups about this, they often sort of respond by saying, my gosh, that's all fairly depressing. Is it possible we can make a dent or make some headway in this? And I would argue we already have. We have a template we can use. So this is a quote from Dr. Stephen Sharfstein, from the formerly president of the American Psychiatric Association, choosing words very, very carefully, that trauma is akin to mental health in the same way smoking is to cancer, which brings up the year 1964 and a very young picture of Cassius Clay. I bring up this year because it's the first year the Surgeon General said there's a pretty clear scientific evidence that smoking leads to lung cancer. This is probably 15 years after the scientific community has begun this work around connecting that association. And if this were 1964, at about the height of my head, I would be sort of partying the smoke to be having this conversation with you all, because half of us as adult Americans are smoking. Fast forward almost 50 years later, and that number is now 18%. Make no mistake, there are still many, many folks to help from a smoking cessation point of view, but that is a public health victory. And JAMA recently did a study and suggested that probably that meant 8 million lives saved. Let me show you one more slide. Yeah. We think this is our next public health opportunity as a group of citizens, as a group of Milwaukeeans, as a group of Wisconsinites, as a group of Americans, and potentially as members of a global community, as we understand sort of the determinants of health, the determinants of well-being. We're starting to appreciate, at least in our world, that this conversation is one of the leading contributors. So this is some interesting work done out of the state of Washington using very tried and tested epidemiological process to say what portion of these particular challenges that we all face, so look at that conditions disturbed 14 plus days of work activity, what portion goes away, that which is predictable is preventable, if we either prevent or successfully mitigate the effects of adversity. And so you can see for yourself that darn near 2/3 of suicide goes away, or more than half of anxiety, or just under 55% of marijuana use. So we're going to close talking a little bit about what we're doing in our respective sort of disciplines to act in a trauma-informed way as a means of sort of talking a little bit about what trauma-informed process looks like. So this is one of my favorite quotes. This is David Brooks. Many of you know his work and his writing. I like this quote because David Brooks is not a social worker, he's not a psychiatrist, he's not a clinician, he's not a judge. He is a representative of the general public who has said, I'm on board. I agree this is a significant priority, and what we might be failed to appreciate is how this frame can actually bring us all together, those of us who normally squabble. So for us, we've now trained 30,000 people, primarily in the Milwaukee area, on this model of trauma-informed care. The idea that when we understand this conversation around prevalence and impact, it leads to a shift in perspective, thinking differently about who the people are in front of us and why they're doing what they're doing. We appreciate the value of performance and regulation, the value of relational connections and tethers and ties, and then we sort of also appreciate what it means to have purpose. Wherever that purpose comes from for us, we understand the value of that. And this is the piece that often gets missed. There is effect, there is challenge on those of us in the helping profession to absorb all these stories and all these narratives from the people we serve. And if we don't pay attention to that, then we would argue that the work sort of stops right there. So we pay attention to the capacity to care for the teachers of the world, for the social workers of the world, for the judges of the world, et cetera, et cetera. I think Judge Triggiano wants to talk a little bit about what's going on in the court system.
I'm going to be really brief because I know we want to answer some of your questions, but so the court system is at the stage of education. Tim and I have trained about 2,500 folks across the state, but mostly in Milwaukee, judges, public defenders, district attorneys, and others. I'm presiding judge at children's court. What that means is I get to make people do things. And so if you are practicing at children's court, you had to attend the 6-hour trauma-informed training that Tim and I did, and that was several years back, and then try to keep up on the issues that are arising as we learn more about trauma and trauma-informed care. So we also, I don't know if Kent Laverne's here, but the Milwaukee County Circuit Courts just got a MacArthur grant, and a piece of that is going to be doing some trauma training, sort of a train the trainer, so people can go back into their stakeholders and do, again, more of this, get the message out about what childhood trauma is, what is the impact, how does it impact behavior, and the work we do in the court system on a daily, weekly, yearly basis. The other thing we did at Children's Court was a National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges came in and did a trauma audit. It was one of the first done in the country. They picked about 6 sites, and they came in with some of their experts that work in trauma and trauma-informed care and talked to us about what we were doing well about interacting with our client base and what we weren't doing so well. And we tried to make changes. So for instance, what does your courtroom look like? How do you interact with your litigants? Do you make them wait out in the hallway like doctors do, right? All of those things went into trying to look at how to create a better trauma-informed environment, because we want for our families predictability, moderation, all those things that we know go a long way in helping them to understand the system. Explaining things to them better so that they understand when they come in the court system what is going on with them and their children. So we did that as well. Family Drug Treatment Court is a court that's been around for 5 years. I've been presiding over it for the last 3. It boasts a team approach. What we've done is the courts have pulled down their silos and says, you know what, we don't know everything about drug treatment and recovery. We need to bring in experts. So we all came together to try to rally the wagons around our families to try to get better results for families who are addicted to alcohol or other drugs that have children removed from their care. We've got some great results. That Family Drug Treatment Court is trained in trauma and applies trauma-informed principles, and I believe we're getting better results, more predictable results because of that. We're also embarking on a healthy infant court. It follows a national model, safe baby courts. There's about a dozen in the country. What that is, again, is the court saying we don't know everything about our babies, but we're starting to learn about the impact of childhood maltreatment and neglect on them. And if we don't get them early on, early matters, if we don't get them into safe, stable environments or help their families do that for them, we are going to end up with very dysregulated children who end up in the juvenile justice system and then the adult court system. So going earlier in the process. Both Family Drug Treatment Court, Healthy Infant Court folks are a team, and we are all trained in trauma and trauma-informed care. And again, I think we are getting better results by looking at what we do with families through a different lens. It is 5 after. We have 5 minutes for questions. That was quick. That's quick.
Please.
Is it possible through behavioral changes or other steps?
So the question was, is it a great question, perhaps the $1 million question or $500 billion question. Is it possible these effects that I showed earlier to reverse them? So this is a really complicated question. The general response I would give you is yes. The other response I would give you is sort of timing matters. So if you look at just sort of the human brain's ability to sort of respond to any kind of activity, we know from a plasticity point of view that sort of it's much more likely to respond early than late. And many of us sort of beyond the age of 40 are appreciating this with each passing day, right, in terms of sort of what diminished plasticity looks like. But that has real relevance in terms of if this kid is now two years old and getting intervened with, supported, helped, et cetera, we like our chances in terms of creating competitive neural process that can say human beings are safe, that can say, you know, human beings care, human beings nurture. And when that happens with enough repetition, you can actually create competitive process. That would be my way of answering that question. The concern I would share with you, though, is our systems are generally engineered to respond to kids at about the age of 12 to 15. Unless you're talking about a school or other systems that are regularly intervening with kids and families, our systems generally get involved where neurobiologically there's a lot less bang for our buck, if that makes sense. Great question, though. Yeah.
What kind of progress are you making at the state level?
I think there's several things going on. One is there's several state legislatures who are working on this issue and bringing some of this information on ACEs to the table at the legislative level. And they have brought in experts from around the country to talk about the economic piece. And a lot of it goes back again to early on when we are investing in our schools, when we are investing on the front end to make sure that the back end, that number there, the big number, that we look at this in more of a general way.
I would just add to that, James Heckman, Art Rolnick, there are many very respected prize-winning economists who are making the human capital argument around this. And you might remember I made this argument last time I was here. I truly believe that the reach of this is much more sort of ubiquitous than we appreciate, that we are going to have to get capital from somewhere. And I get more and more concerned when I look at the trajectory in terms of the experiential script, right? I get more concerned in terms of the effect on capital and say, where's our workforce going to come from? Those of you struggling with that right now, I'm speaking to the choir, I think, right, in terms of what those challenges are. I think we have a choice about reinvesting in sort of our capital or not. And I keep going back to what's predictable is preventable, but here's where some people get stuck. Some people get stuck with the ACEs frame and say, okay, well, that makes sense, right? A lot of difficult stuff, so you drank. A lot of difficult stuff, so the drive-through and the Baconator, which I referenced earlier, happened a bit too often. So I understand that perspective, but let me give you a couple more pieces of data. How would we explain a 10% increase in arthritis based on 4 more ACEs? What behavioral outcome is that associated with? How might we explain a higher incidence of cancer occurrence with a higher ACE score? When we start to truly appreciate sort of the molecular, that's Dr. Folletti's word, sort of effect of this exposure to sort of stress and adversity, we start to, in my mind, make it a little less us and they and a little bit more about all of us, right? That as we think about sort of the true effects of this, it's all of our collective priority to say what role can we play to sort of not just save money, not just sort of have greater human capital, but maybe to sort of have a little less violence. And one of those worlds I think we're all in this to sort of try to create. So, great question, yeah. Well, so I think I appreciate the profoundness of your question, so let me sort of try to take at least one angle on it. This has been replicated in 32 states, and the results are pretty comparable across those 32 states. Now, what that affords us is at least some perspective on this isn't a Wisconsin issue or a California issue. This might truly be about how the human brain and body respond to adversity and stress. The other thing I'm going to take the opportunity to sort of parlay your question into, which may or may not have been your intent, is another angle to this is multi-generational experiences. So I just did this presentation at the Department of Corrections conference last Friday, and a psychiatrist, a very long-term psychiatrist in Wisconsin, came up to me afterwards and said, you know, your comments around the Holocaust struck me particularly in a unique way. This idea that if we appreciate stress and trauma in the current sort of environment, what kids experience, but then if we think about maybe 200 years, or 500 years, or 1,000 years, depending on your group's history of oppression, we have a whole different way to think about sort of contributing effects. So it's another angle perhaps to your question around how do we sort of think about this before the kid was born? And especially when you factor in this epigenetic discussion, the idea that kids might be born with predisposition to have difficulty regulating exposure to stress, that is a powerful conclusion. And many of the folks in the epigenetics world would argue that's a contributing factor. Maybe we can just say amen, right? So let me just say one more thing about that. We have some projects going right now where we're actually not just teaching the parents, we're teaching the kids. Very, very quick story because we're getting the proverbial hook, which we said we were going to be receptive to, right, Dan? So I have a youngster I just got involved consulting with last week. One of our clinicians took his pulse. This is about a 10-year-old kid. In one arm it was 38, and 10 seconds later in another arm it was 117. That is a sort of stress response process that we see over and over and over again. And the medical community often looks at me with a furrowed eyebrow and says, what are you talking about? Until we sort of expose them to some of the same content, and then they start to come around and say, oh, I see, vasovagal, that makes sense, right? So we see this all the time. The point I want to make is if I live that, imagine how that feels. Just think for a moment about the last time your heart rate sort of dropped or went up 20 beats per minute. And then imagine this happens not when you control it by getting on a treadmill, but by an experiential process where you get a trigger that evokes that same stress response process. One of the most powerful things with education, with parents and kids, is to say that's normal. That's normal in the context of adapting to stress and trauma. And that freedom, I could tell you story after story about when kids and adults hear that, you can see the relief flood from their faces. You can see it happen. So education is a really powerful tool, not just to sort of teach about positive parenting, but also to teach about how we make sense of what's going on internally.
Yeah, I would only add, you're not pulling us off, right? I would only add that with the beginnings of the Family Drug Treatment Court and the Healthy Infant Court, we are focusing on better parenting skills and the interconnection between the parent and the child, and really bringing to bear more evidence-based practices around what you're talking about, and we are getting phenomenal results from that.
What's predictable is preventable. I think we all heard something that, you know, we'll all walk out of here thinking about and hopefully be in a position to do something about it. Thank you both for a really insightful presentation. I think you deserve another round of applause for that.
An MCM production.